Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we start out in the Avdiivka section of the front line where the Russians have stormed their Ukrainian positions in the direction of Novoselivka, Persha. The Russian advances in this direction have been duplicated with multiple footages. The first one is here in the direction of Novopokrovsk in the north, where the Russians have been geolocated to raise the flag over the western outskirts of Novopokrovsk, signaling the complete capture of the village as was reported by Deep State Map. Following that, we have this piece of geolocated footage here north of Umansk, where the Russians have advanced along the road from the direction in between Semenivka and Umansk in a northern direction to capture the section of the front line west of the main road. This is to capture the southern flank and Ukrainian fortified positions south of the main road, where the Russians took advantage of the capture of Novopokrovsk to advance directly towards Novoselivka Persha with the control over the northern and southern flank through the assaults here to the north and to the south of the main road. It allowed the Russians to then push directly along the road, which brings us to the final geolocated footage as the Russians have reached the eastern outskirts of the Novoselivka Persha direction. With this, the Russians have closed in towards the town from the east and from the south. At the same time, fighting continues in the direction of Sukil, and with the Russian capture of Novopokrovsk, they can attack from the northeast as well. So with attacks from the northeast, east, and southeast, the Russians will now be able to attack Novoselivka Persha from multiple directions. If the Russians in the north manage to capture Sukil, then they will be able to attack Novoselivka Persha from the north as well. This significantly endangers the Ukrainian positions within the town and may force the Ukrainians to abandon it for the next line of defense along the Vovcha River, here to the west of Avdiivka and Novoselivka Persha, along the Ukrainian fortified positions along the river line. With this, we see that the Russians are pushing through and are intensifying the offensive operations in the direction where they have managed to gain a foothold within Sukil, capture Novopokrovsk, and storm to the outskirts of Novoselivka Persha, and they have managed to push through towards Kharkiv, both the northern and southern parts of the village, west of Netailove, and they have managed to capture the majority of Novoselivka, leaving half of it in a gray zone. South of this, in the direction of Krasnodarivka, we see continuous positional fighting along the central parts of the city, where this geolocated footage shows a Russian assault on Ukrainian buildings here in the eastern parts of the city. With this, we see positional fighting and street fighting continues in the central parts of the city, as the Russians slowly inch their way through with heavy fighting in the city to push through the Ukrainian defensive positions and capture new parts. This geolocated footage is in positions that the Russians already were in control of, indicating that the Ukrainians are launching counterattacks to recapture some positions, and the Russians then respond to that by recapturing the positions that the Ukrainians recaptured. This may sound confusing, but in the end it's a back and forth in the central parts of the city as the Ukrainians attempt to hold on to the city and the Russians continue to push the Ukrainian forces back. Moving further north in the direction of Novoselivka, where the Russians recently got a foothold on the eastern parts of the village. According to the latest update by Deep State Map, the Russians have advanced northwest of Vesele, significantly increasing the area that they are in control of by pushing through the forest patch to the north of Vesele, capturing further fortified positions. As for the west of Vesele, the Russians have also pushed across the Sukha River, where they've managed to capture fortified positions here west of Vesele, east of Novoselivka. This is what allowed the Russians to push through towards the eastern parts of Novoselivka and gain a foothold within the village. So with this, we see that the Russians continue not just attacks towards Novoselivka itself, but also on the northern part of the river line, where they push along the forest lines and to the Ukrainian fortified positions to gain control over those positions, which strengthens the Russian flank for an assault towards Novoselivka, in which they gained the foothold. This means that the Russian foothold could not be gained without the control over these fortified positions. Although those fortified positions aren't entirely under Russian control with Deep State Map, with this gray zone in between, we also see that the area in which the Russians were geolocated within Novoselivka remain in the gray zone, and at the same time the fact that the Russians' front line is so close to the fortified positions means that the Russians likely have control of them, or at the very least that the Ukrainians were pushed out of them. This again allowed the Russians to push towards Novoselivka, where geolocated footage confirmed their presence. So with this, we see that the Russians have indeed captured these positions, and they have pushed through the Ukrainian positions along the northwest of Vesele, northeast of Novoselivka, and will continue to do so in a northern direction as they push along the fortified positions, cutting off Novoselivka from supplies and storming it head-on, forcing Ukrainians to withdraw from them to their fortified positions before the Russians cut them off. Further north here in the direction of Kislivka, the Russians have stormed the Ukrainian fortified positions south of Kotlyarivka. This was confirmed with footage of Russian soldiers storming these positions, after which the Ukrainians responded by sending FPV drones. This means that the final part of the trench is in the gray zone and the eastern part is now under Russian control. They will likely continue to capture the rest of it, which will strengthen the Russian positions south of Kotlyarivka and by Avdiivka, where they'll push across to the next fortified position to strengthen the southern flank of Stepova Novoselivka. The Russians have aligned the front line east of Stepova Novoselivka, but they have not yet stormed the village. This will likely take place as the Russians will push through the next fortified position, or Stepova Novoselivka either one first, after which they will strengthen their position to capture the next part, either by flanking from the south or from the north. Further north here in the direction of the Kharkiv offensive, there's been no updates over the past 24 hours as a lot of back and forth is happening in the north, where the Ukrainians continue their counterattacks in the direction of Lyboke, north of Lipsy, and the Russian and Ukrainian forces continue the back and forth in Vovchansk. This brings us to the upcoming Ukrainian peace conference, where they are trying to create a basis or standpoint for peace. However, it is unlikely to succeed, as The Economist writes, and as I said about a week ago. It is mainly PR, and the majority of third world countries or other unaligned countries are not going to appear, and that is due to one major issue with this peace conference, and that is that Russia is not invited. Now, that means that this peace conference is one where the warring parts are not even going to be negotiating with each other. Therefore, as The Economist writes, serious negotiations are unlikely to begin before the year's end at the earliest, as neither side will really push for negotiations as the front line is right now, with practically a stalemate going on, and neither side is clearly coming out on top in terms of territory. The Russians have annexed the regions of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk, yet does not hold clear control over those regions. Some even argue that the Russians may have an interest in the regions of Kharkiv, Dnipro, Mykolaiv, Odessa, and other regions in Ukraine, and with no clear control over those, they do not have the territorial control necessary for or to push such a territorial demand. However, Putin did come forward with a peace deal that he has in mind right now as an ultimatum to Ukraine. In the peace deal, he says that the Ukrainians should withdraw from Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk, stop actions of war in those areas, refuse or give up the idea of joining NATO, and the usual denazify, demilitarize, and so on. All of those criteria, and then Russia will stop the war, is what he said. He sent that as an ultimatum to the West, where he expected both Ukraine and the West to reply. He did this during a speech yesterday. Today, Ukraine's Zelensky has said he will not agree to such a deal. He says the ceasefire offer cannot be trusted, and therefore he will not be going along with it. I say this acts as an ultimatum, exactly as written in this Reuters headline, due to the fact of the wording of Vladimir Putin. He says, and I quote, "Today we are making another real peace proposal, but if the West and Kiev refuse, it is their responsibility for the bloodshed. We are not talking about freezing the conflict, but about its final end." End quote. We also have Lavrov following up with Moscow will wait for a reaction to Putin's new proposals. Russia is not going to run after any country. That means take your time and respond when you have come to a decision. This sounds very much like an ultimatum, something along the lines of, if you do not accept this deal, then we will escalate the war further. This may be an indication of the upcoming Russian offensive. That is a massive offensive that I've been predicting for a long time. The reason for that is the fact that if no negotiation is settled, therefore the Russians only have one way to achieve its desired results, and that is by using force. That means the Russians need to launch an offensive to take by force what the Russians want to take, either the 4 regions or more, depending on what they feel like, really. And this has to be done by winning militarily on the battlefield. The West continues to send more aid to Ukraine, where they recently made a deal about $50 billion additional dollars on top of what was announced by the United States and what regularly comes from Europe to Ukraine. This would add up to approximately 150 billion euros/dollars for 2024 alone. Therefore, Russia is in a position where if they want to end the war, then the sooner the better, as the United States and Europe is not stopping with additional aid to Ukraine, even if the price keeps rising as it has been, where in 2022 they did not send that much, about 50 billion. 2023 it raised up to 100 billion and now up to 150 billion. That is a 100% increase in the first year and 200% increase in total for the second year. So all in all, what will happen in the future, only time will tell, but there is a clear indication that the bloodshed will significantly increase as Ukraine receives more weapons and Russia increases their production and recruitment of further military personnel for this war. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.